In this video, we're going to bring in our character rig and start the process of doing our final character animation. So let's bring in the rig from the library and scale it down. We need to think about how tall she should be when she's standing up. Now, an issue I can see right away is because we have the lower camera angle, we can see by the bounding box of our character that it's slightly tilted in perspective. And that actually ends up making the character look more flat. Fortunately, there's an easy way to fix that. In the layer settings for the character, there's a setting called Face Camera. If I set this to Face Image Plane Free Rotate, the layer will always rotate however it needs to appear parallel to the screen. Now I want to see the timing of my rough animation, so I'll turn on the channel visibility for my frame by frame layer. Now I want to retime this a little so there's time for a pose before this where Betsy is off screen and takes a step into this first position. A handy trick for doing that is to right click on a keyframe and then you have the option to select keys to right. Then I can just drag everything over. And I'll do the same for the keys on the camera channels. Then I'm actually going to mute the channels for the camera move because I want to be able to focus on the full character as I'm animating her. Now let's get the character in position and hook up the target bones for the ankles. Now the first phase of the animation process is called blocking out. This is where I just pose out the rig to create all the key poses for the shot. In this case, by matching up to my rough drawings. Notice I have the default interpolation set to step for this phase, meaning it's not going to add in-betweens yet. These poses are just going to hold in place just like the rough drawings. I'm also doing freeze keys on all these key poses. Also, I'm not worrying about the hands or face at this point. I'm going to need to go back and make some new hand positions to match the gestures in the drawings. We'll do all that in separate passes. I'm noticing that the foot is flattening out too much on some of these poses. I'm going to have to modify the rig to get the range of motion in the ankle that we need. Now for this pose, we want the head to face the other way. To do that, we need to flip the bone. Up here are buttons to flip the bone, and we want this one that flips it sideways. Normally that would be enough. However, in our case, we have an issue. If I lift up the head, you can see the neck is getting twisted. This is because we used point binding to attach the top of the neck to the head bone. This is a big downside of using point rigging, but to fix this, we can just go to the neck layer and select the top 3 points and then flip those horizontally with the controls in the top bar. Now it looks right and we can finish the rest of the pose. At this pose, we're at the first place where we want to use the other version of our braid. So I'll switch the switch to braid sketch. And I think I want to turn on squash and stretch for the braid bones. Then I can draw with the sketch bone tool so the braid is going the opposite direction. Then on the next pose, I need to flip the head back and flip the neck points back. We still want the sketch bone braid, so I won't change that back, but I'll make sure it's on the other side of the head. Then I can just continue blocking things out. Here on this standing pose, I need the foot pointed the other way, so I'll flip the leg bone like we did with the head, and the foot flips with it. Thankfully, this doesn't wreck any of our actual art layers. From here, I can continue working. Notice I've been using onion skinning to make sure the feet line up as she goes through all these poses. As she puts her hands on her hips, I'm realizing her left elbow doesn't look great bent this direction, but we'll fix that later. Now we're to the point where she turns and walks forward. It's a little harder to make the walking convincing the more forward-facing she is. We need to rely more on shortening the leg bones because of the perspective, which doesn't read as clearly. Fortunately, since we're zooming in anyway, the feet and legs will go out of frame pretty fast. I'm also moving the character forward in 3D space instead of just scaling her up. Because of the camera move, it's going to look better if there's an actual perspective change on the character relative to the background. Okay, I've got all the poses blocked in now, but I want to modify some of our smart bone actions to accommodate these poses. First, for the boots, I'm going to go into all the smart bone actions to increase the range of motion for the first foot bone, and make sure the foot maintains its volume even at this new angle. Then on that left elbow, we need to be able to bend it left as well as right, but we never set that up. So I'll make an action that shapes the elbow folds properly when it bends in this direction. Okay, so those poses will look better now. Now there's one last pose we need. At the very start, we want a pose of her that starts off screen. That's why we gave ourselves those extra frames. Okay, now that we've got all our key poses blocked out, we need to make it transition properly from one pose to the next. I start by setting a set of keyframes to linear interpolation. You could also use smooth or one of the ease in, ease out interpolations, if that makes sense for the particular spot you're at. Then I check how that default motion looks and add additional in-between keyframes that make the motion more correct. I'm especially focusing on the feet and using onion skinning to make sure they're staying in place as the layer for the character moves. For the head turn, I need to find the exact right frame in the middle of the turn where the head bone needs to flip, and the right place to transition from the dynamic braid to the sketch bone braid. For the point where she stops at the entryway, I'm going to enable squash and stretch scaling and IK stretching on the leg bones so she can stretch a little further when she pops up and then settles into the resting pose. Here where she stops in her tracks, the IK for the legs is getting a little haywire, because I had the knee break and bend the other direction for that one pose. So I need to track down frame by frame exactly the frame where it should change from one direction to the other. And also it looks like we're pushing the limits of the skirt here on a few frames because the thigh needs to come up pretty high. We may need to extend the range of the skirt actions too. But for now, let's just finish our rough in-between. Okay, that's all the in-between frames we want to put in. Now let's switch to the motion graph and work on smoothing out our curves. I'm starting with the main root bone, specifically the Y dimension, because that's going to define the overall motion of the body. I'm just converting my keyframes to Bezier and using the handles to smooth out the curve so she's transitioning smoothly when she changes the direction she's moving. On the curve for the foot target bones, things are a little more jagged, so I'm going to shift points around in addition to using the Bezier handles to create smoother arcs. It's really important for the whole path and speed of the step to be in nice fluid arcs, otherwise the walk won't look natural. In fact, whenever possible, I'm going to delete keyframes entirely and just rely on the curve handles to get things in the right position. When I get to this stopping animation, I'm finding that it could use some more time to play out and let the leg hang longer. So I'm going to select my keys and move them to the right to put some more frames in between each of the keyframes. Got to make sure to move all the camera frames over to match. When I get into smoothing the bones for the spine up through the head, I'm being very aggressive about deleting extraneous points and making bigger, smoother curves. That makes it easier to control the overall arc and bend of the body over the course of longer sections of the animation. And it makes it easier to use the curve handles to overshoot and offset the peaks and valleys of the curve so the bones in the chain can offset a little like we did with the arms on our walk cycle. And of course, the same idea applies to the arms here as well. It always adds some nice overlapping action when you can get different parts of the body moving on different timing. On this stop animation especially, there should be a lot of overlapping action as the leg, spine, head, arms all slow and change direction at different rates. Now for this spot here where she puts her hands on her hips, I'm actually going to switch to using the target bones for the arms. Thankfully, bone targeting is something you can switch on and off in the middle of an animation. Then once the hands are in contact with the hips, I'm going to parent the target bones to the hips so I know they won't shift around. Then when she goes to touch her chin, I'll break the target bone link on that hand, and then the other one a few frames later. Now the motion of the body is good, so we're ready to start doing our finishing touches, like going through and matching up the skirt. I know there's some spots where the skirt doesn't quite stretch far enough. I could try changing the angle of the hip bone, but I don't want to compromise the animation we just did. So I'm going to extend the range of motion on the skirt bone actions. This time I'm actually going to extend the angle constraints of the bone dials. And inside the actions for the skirt, I'm actually going to make an additional keyframe at 60 past the one here that we already set for the farthest stretch position at 48. This way, anywhere in the animation where I've already set the skirt position, it should remain pretty close. Then I can just finish positioning the skirt on all of the poses. I'll try to keep the number of keys I use to a minimum and rely on the motion curve to make sure the skirt is changing shape right. Now I'm going to do a pass where I focus on the ponytail. For the section here where it's in sketchboard mode, I want to make sure it's following nicely along the path the head is traveling. And I want it to swing, overshoot, and settle when she comes to a rest by the entrance. In the sections where it's in dynamic mode, I'm going to go in one more time and play around with the bone dynamics so it bounces right in these particular shots. Now I need those new hand poses, so I'm going to duplicate some of the positions already in the switches and then modify the fingers. Then I just make sure it switches to those hand poses at the right point in the animation. And now, just to make that transition to shot 2 smoother at the entryway, I'm going to shift all the keyframes over to create a slight pause before she starts moving after the camera angle cuts. I'm going to copy and paste that first set of keyframes and set them to step to make sure there's no accidental animation during the pause. Cool, now let's play the scene and see how it looks. Awesome. Now the next big thing holding back the scene from being great is that we haven't done much with the facial animation. And also she is going to have a line of dialogue when she notices the globe. So I'll do the facial animation and lip sync in the next video. I'll see you there.